And we are live. Welcome to Crypto Law TV. I'm John Deaton, the founder and your host. I hope everybody had a great 4th of July. Crypto Law took the week off. We're back to our weekly live stream. As far as the Ripple case, we're still on standby. I'm not going to repeat everything I did last time or my tweet that I sent out yesterday, but I encourage you to look at it. I gave an example of two things to take hold in, and that is one, there is a case at the same time as Ripple that had reply briefs in December, and just like Ripple, Judge Torres has not reached her ruling yet. And I also provided a case that took 8.5 months from the time the reply briefs were filed. We are at now 7 months, 7.5 months. So that's just another example of this takes longer than we expect. Try to be as patient as you can. It is extremely difficult. I get it, but that's where we're at with the Ripple case. Today, I'm not going to talk a lot about it, but there was a criminal case filed out of the Southern District of New York, and that involved basically someone who manipulated a smart contract on a decentralized exchange. And what I want to say about that is that's what we want to encourage. We want to support that type of enforcement action, that type of regulation. When our regulators get it right and they pursue fraud and they pursue theft, that's what we need to support. That's where all this effort should be. So just remember, when you have a new technology like we do with blockchain and cryptocurrencies, all that is an opportunity for old age fraud, just in a new arena to be basically to take place, and we need to stamp it out. My big criticism, of course, with the SEC is that they have not spent their limited resources on the fraud, on the manipulation, on the misrepresentation, on the pump and dumps, on the meme coins that are being manipulated, and instead are focusing their attention on Section 5 cases, against good players in the business, basically, and not providing clarity. So just remember, when the regulator gets it right, we should celebrate them. When they get it wrong, we should hold them accountable. And that's what we want to do. The big news for the week has been nothing but the BlackRock ETF and the discussion. And that is a big deal, people. And the reason I say it's a big deal is because you don't get any bigger. You don't get anything more traditional finance than the largest asset manager in the world. I've heard 9 trillion, I've heard 11 trillion. We're going to call it 10 trillion. That BlackRock has 10 trillion in assets under management. Larry Fink just a few years ago gave that narrative how Bitcoin and crypto was for money laundering and things of that nature. You just fast forward a few years, and what does he tell you? He says Bitcoin is an international asset. And he also talked about crypto, and he didn't use Bitcoin and crypto interchangeably, because I believe when you read the tea leaves that he believes there's going to be more than just Bitcoin. And I don't mean just ETH by that as well. And I don't just mean XRP, that there are going to be types of cryptos. And he talked about something that we've all been talking about for years, and that is the tokenization of real world assets, real estate, stocks, traditional stocks, all of those things. And so the big winner, as far as I believe, and this is what's fascinating, and we're going to talk about how this plays out as we move forward, but who was named in all of these ETFs, these spot Bitcoin ETFs, as, let's call it, the surveillance partner or custodial exchange? Coinbase. Coinbase was listed in BlackRock's. Coinbase was listed in Kathy Wood's ARK investment, in the CBOE, 5 spot Bitcoin ETF applications. Coinbase is listed in all 5, including Fidelity. So when you have all of these major traditional Wall Streeters talking about how they're partnering and using Coinbase, at the same time that Coinbase is being pursued by the SEC. I don't see how that plays out, right? Dave Weisberger, who is the CEO of, I think it's CoinShares, he's recently been saying, so I want to give credit where it's due, that we're in the negotiation phase. Remember, Tim Draper talked about with Gary Gensler on stage in 2018. They laugh at you. Then after they ignore you and laugh at you, then they get together and say, we're not going to let this happen. And then they realize they can't stop it. So what they do is they get their friends and their regulators to sue you and to litigate it. And then finally they buy you or adopt you. And David has said that we're in that negotiation phase. And at some point, I got to imagine if there's an ETF granted with a BlackRock, for example, if that happens, I think Larry Fink picks up the phone. How are you going to be using Coinbase as your partner while they're being sued? How do you report that in your quarterlies? How do you report that in your registration? All of those things, right? And so I think Dave may be onto something about this negotiation phase. And so it seems to me that Coinbase is a big winner when it comes to that. And so we'll see how that plays out. Now, speaking of Coinbase, the other big news is now we've got Coinbase had filed a letter to the judge, basically saying to the judge, we're providing the court with our intent that we're going to file a motion. It's under a rule called 12C. It is a motion for judgment on the pleadings. Now, that's something that Ripple never did. So that's something that many of the XRP holders who are now quasi-experts in litigation, securities litigation, did not see. I think Ripple may have tried that had the major questions doctrine been as ripe as it is today. But basically, Coinbase said, look, they cite Gary Gensler's testimony where Gary Gensler said that crypto exchanges like Coinbase, they fall within this gap. He didn't necessarily use the word gap, but he said there's no regulatory framework between the SEC and the CFTC. And then when you couple that with the Hinman emails where the SEC senior officials talk about a regulatory gap that exists, and you take all of that and you couple it with the fact that Congress has got 15 bills that have been proposed where they're showing their intent to legislate this regulatory gap to provide that clarity to the market, Coinbase is saying, look, you don't even have jurisdiction here because you've acknowledged you don't have jurisdiction. You only have jurisdiction over securities. And in order for these to be securities, they have to be investment contracts under Howey, and they're not. And therefore, you don't even get to pursue this case, right? That is an extraordinary argument. I'm not necessarily saying it's going to win. I'm going to tell you what I think is going to happen. But it reminds me of something that hasn't gotten a lot of publicity, but there was James Katulis, a finance guy, basically was involved in the Let's Go Brandon meme coin that was meant as a joke that turned into something in NASCAR. You can look it up. But the SEC subpoenaed basically his communications with conservatives like Candace Owens. And he's moved to quash that subpoena. And XRP holders should be proud because our brief is cited throughout his motion to quash, where he's saying to the SEC, I don't have to even honor the subpoena. This is a meme coin. It's not a security. It doesn't even come close to meeting, most, if any, of the Howey factors. So they're attacking it on that level. It's a similar argument. And these are great arguments to make because it's highlighting more and more and more to the Supreme Court and to others and to Congress that you have to do something. And so basically, the SEC is pursuing basically that. And the SEC has let the judge know that the Coinbase model is basically they just find a buyer and a seller, and they match that buyer and that seller in the secondary market. And there is nothing other than an asset purchase that takes place. There's no promises made. There's no further engagement after that asset sell, right? Same arguments you heard in the Ripple case. No post-sell obligations or duties. There's no legal interest involved. They just match the buyer and the seller, boom. And of course, Coinbase also says, hey, they're going after our staking platform and whatnot, and arguing that proof of stake, basically the SEC is arguing that proof of stake systems basically are a investment contract, and SEC puts all that stuff out. So, and then of course the SEC is relying on the major questions doctrine that I already discussed and citing that regulatory gap. The SEC's response to that is that they're like, okay, file your motion, but they're letting the judge know we're going to move to strike the major questions doctrine, the abuse of discretion defense, the equitable estoppel defense, and certain other affirmative defenses that the SEC pled. And of course, the SEC highlights the registration agreement. They say to the SEC, and they're saying to the judge, hey, the SEC is making a big deal about the fact that we approved their registration statement. Well, judge, their registration statement, the very one that we approved, talks about how a risk to the business is, in fact, if a regulator like the SEC states and argues that they're selling unregistered securities. And of course, when you go to Coinbase's quarterly results and they talk about risks to the platform, they talk about how the SEC could claim that certain tokens are securities. They talk about how Satoshi Nakamoto's identity, if becomes known, could threaten their business or threaten at least the price of Bitcoin. If the 1 million Bitcoin Satoshi coins are moved somehow, that's a risk. But one of the major risks are these could be called securities. And so the SEC is saying, basically, Coinbase, your argument falls on its face because you've acknowledged this from the beginning. And the point of all this is that these are boilerplate kind of comments. The SEC says, right, we are approving your IPO and your registration statement because it's in the public's interest, even though they know what the business model is. Let's all be honest. They know it. But they're going to keep disclaimers in there, right? That this isn't basically a blessing of your underlying business model. Just like when Bill Hinman or anybody gets up and gives a speech, Gary Gensler, this really isn't, you can't hold me to what I'm going to say. There's these legalese disclaimers that go both ways. And I don't think either one of those are going to win the day. Ultimately, this move, in my opinion, by Coinbase is a great move, because I think what we're looking at is an interlocutory appeal if they can get it, and they can beat everyone to the appellate court, maybe even to the, if they can get to the Second Circuit and point to all this recent Supreme Court law. And if they lose there, maybe even, ask for cert, all before trying to litigate it. I'm not saying that's going to happen, but I think that is an angle that they're trying to get. To basically that would postpone even the underlying litigation in the case. And so that's basically where we're at with Coinbase and the SEC. What I want to point out, though, is that everyone's catching up to XRP holders now. We've been starting and fighting from January 1st of 2021, arguing that secondary market sales are in jeopardy here. We've been arguing this from day one, and the SEC now, the Coinbase, I should say, is saying we're just a secondary markets asset seller. And crazy in the SEC's response, I guess not crazy, but they cite the library decision. And they cite the library decision saying that the judge, Barbadaro, did not distinguish, in his opinion, between direct sales and secondary market sales. And what are we waiting for right now? We're waiting for the judge and library to write that second opinion in order as it relates to the penalties phase. And that's when Naomi Brockwell, who deserves a lot of credit, allowed me on her behalf to go into court and argue to the judge, listen, at least clarify, please, judge, clarify that your order does not implicate secondary market sales. You don't have to say that no secondary market sales are never securities. Just make it clear that your order does not apply to that, and you never intended it to apply to secondary market sales. And the judge promised to do that. Now, we haven't seen it in writing, but I point that out to you because a lot of people were saying, why are you going there? It's the penalty phase. The summary judgment was already decided. And remember, I said every single court battle matters. And now we see this as evidenced by the SEC making a big deal out of that library decision where it was not distinguished. And that's why we have to go in and fight, which brings me to the point about, why get involved in amicus for Coinbase? And I have to be honest with everyone out there. Tribalism is exhausting. It really is absolutely frustrating and exhausting. I just want you to remember when I first filed the writ of mandamus and got involved in the Ripple case, all the people that dislike Ripple said, why are you helping Ripple? This is ridiculous. Ripple dumped on XRP holders. There's XRP holders who feel that way. Why are you helping Ripple, John? And I kept saying, it's not about Ripple. I don't give a shit about Ripple. Okay, this is about secondary market sales. This is about property rights. This is about freedom. This is about being able to have your own asset. This is about stopping government overreach. That's what it's about. I don't care about Ripple. And a lot of the XRP holders, they agreed with that, and they would say the same thing. But now, because Coinbase delisted XRP and they haven't relisted XRP, I have people saying to me, why would you help Coinbase? I don't care about Coinbase. It is about the secondary market sale. And we have to distinguish those things. And so I'm not telling you to join if you don't want to join. I'm just saying, if you are a Coinbase customer and you don't want Coinbase to speak to you for you, and you certainly don't want the SEC to speak for you, then that's why you join, to have your own voice heard. And thank God that Naomi Brockwell agreed with that, because we wouldn't have even a fighting chance if she didn't. And that's why I encourage you all to get involved. So anyways, now the last thing to talk about is sort of what's been going on in the last 2 weeks since our last live stream. Is there's a company in crypto that came out of nowhere and completely unknown to most of us who've been involved in crypto for at least the last 5-6 years. And that is Prometheum. In fact, it's not just me and others, but I think we have a quote from Charles Hodgkinson from Cardano, right? Who is an Ethereum co-founder. And look what he said. Who the hell are these guys? And, I think that was a sincere tweet by Charles. And how did these guys end up being a witness for the Democrats? And that's the thing to know about these hearings. These hearings, right? Whoever is in the majority gets to dictate the hearing. They set the agenda. And then each side gets their witnesses. And the Democrats, chose Prometheum. I just say, hey, just get right people. Like I've encouraged Mark Cuban to be called as a witness. No one's asking for individual holders to be represented, right? We get the traditional people that, however they get picked. But this company called Prometheum and its co-founder, Aaron Kaplan, got chosen. And what we learned was that this fella named Aaron Kaplan, he basically called Coinbase. What was the word? Coinbase and Kraken scofflaws, companies that won't comply with come in and register. And when you listen to him testify, it was as if Gary Gensler had a substitute to surrogate to go in there and testify on his behalf, because this gentleman for Promethean said that there was no lack of regulatory clarity. He interestingly flipped. In 2021, he had a letter that said, we need new laws. We need Congress to do its job and enact laws. He talked about the lack of regulatory clarity, everything everyone else in crypto was saying, except now he flipped from 2021 to in 2023 to testify. And he testified that there is a path to compliance that has been laid out by the SEC. He said basically when Gary Gensler gets up there and says, come on in and register. Well, that's what we did. That's what Promethean did. We went in, took Gary under his advice, walked in, and we registered. And all these other companies, that are crying for new legislation, they're the bad actors. They don't want to comply. He said, basically, there is no need for Warren Davidson or Tom Emmer or Patrick McHenry to be spending late hours writing up legislation. We don't need that. It is crystal clear. He basically called the Paul Graywells and the Brian Armstrongs and the Jesse Powells of the world the bad guys, right? Who don't want to come in and register. He said non-compliance is a choice. And right after that, Gary Gensler gets on TV. Is it a coincidence? And Gary Gensler says, we're making progress. Just a couple weeks ago, we had a company come in and register. And he used Prometheum as an example of how to register because of this narrative that he's pushing. All right. So is it a coincidence that these fellas show up as a Democrat witnesses who flip-flop from what they said before, or is this politics involved in creating a narrative? And I was trying to figure out this Promethean business model. And then I came across, so I wish I could give credit to whoever it was on Twitter. And I apologize that I don't. I would if I could remember who it was. And I came across a picture that embodied the Promethean business model. And here it is. That's it. A vending machine, sort of an analogy to their business, but there's nothing in it. There's nothing you can sell. And just like this empty vending machine, they can't tell you what they're can sell. They can't even sell Bitcoin and Ethereum, which represents 70 to 75% of the market. They can't even do that. It's just an empty business. And they can't tell you what tokens in the future they're going to sell. And their only answer is, well, we want to crawl before we walk. Okay, so what we know what's going on is politics, but the XRP Army launched into action. Eleanor Terrett got involved, and the Blockchain Association got involved. And so on June 13th, the CEO, Aaron Kaplan, testified. And then on June 15th, Marissa Koppel filed FOIA requests seeking records related to Prometheum. Everyone should go see Laura Shen's podcast where Aaron Kaplan is on the Rodrigo Unchained podcast. I watched that. It's very entertaining. July 10th, Senator Tuberville and Reps Blaine, Press, Norman, and Alfrod sent a letter to the SEC and the DOJ asserting that Aaron Kaplan provided false testimony at the June 13th hearing. Okay, and so I'll leave it up to you to decide whether or not this is politics and we are involved in someone who was just lucky and they've been involved and we just didn't know about them and they got the call to come in and register, or all of a sudden they get a registration and can be held up and out as look, here's a company that did it, no problem. Shame on Coinbase, shame on everybody else in the industry. I'll leave it up to you to decide. I'm suspicious. I think there's more to it, and I believe we're going to find out eventually. But with that, I'll see you next week. Have a great week.